we are saying that if you are claiming something, right? If you are saying that there's a machine in the past, let's say, right? You need to tell me either the prototype of that, right, or the design of that, or at least a sense of the direction in which the thought process developed to reach that point of discovery or invention, right? So we are very rigorous in that. And I think that India has to be a Vishwa Guru in that sense, right? In terms of being brave enough to say that reality is sometimes beyond empiricism, right? Reality is not always experimental, right? All the parts of the universe are not accessible to us, right? So in fact, some of the viewers may be interested to know that in the very boundary of the universe, right, at the very periphery of the universe, there is a certain side of the certain part of the universe which cannot be reached even by light, right? If you were to send light there, right, it's called the event horizon, and beyond that, that is not even accessible, right? So if we cannot even access some parts of the universe, right, how can we possibly speak about the phenomena in terms of science, right? If there is no observation possible in some parts of the universe, right, by default, right, then we cannot even talk about science in those realms, right? So does that mean that there is no reality to it?
Welcome, Dr. Mrittunjoy Guha Mujumdar. You have very long name. Okay, so first, you are young, dynamic scientist. Okay, and whatever I have followed you through, on LinkedIn, I have gone through some of your articles which you have written and the talks you have given. So I can see that you have extensive interest, beyond science as well. And of course, you are a good citizen of India as well because you think about India, and you have interest in ancient science as well and spiritualism as well. The way you have given the talk so far, the way you have written so far. So accordingly, I have come to that conclusion. Prior to that, let me introduce you. I'll just go through some of your work experience. So right now, you are professor at UPES Dehradun, right?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. And you have taught physics at Delhi University, at Cambridge University prior to that. And
Yes.
you have been postdoctoral fellow at Indian Institute of Science and then Tata Institute of, I think, Fundamental Research. Tata Institute of
Yes.
Fundamental Research. Then you have given recently one talk on science popularization on Doordarshan. I think that was very, very popular and it was very, very impactful as well. You are also interested in science policy. You have worked with, Human Resource Development of India and then Cambridge University. So both you have worked. And most important thing, I think, you are interested that you want to take this science to the new generation. You are also from the new generation only. You are very young, so I think you can understand their dynamics and their interest, and you want to give the direction to the young minds. So that is really wonderful. And today, I'm being a yoga coach by profession. I'm interested, to understand what is the difference between science and spiritualism according to you. Of course, I have my own opinions, but understanding from the scientists like you, it would be like very, very insightful thing and interesting as well. So before we start, I want to understand your definition of science, your definition of spiritualism. How do you look at that?
Right. So that's a very important question and a very fundamental question at that. And I think I would like to bring in a discussion we had recently based on something which was there on Twitter, right? So there are some questions sometimes people ask on these lines. That's exactly what you mentioned. And the question was on the lines of what is it that science or physics, right, at the moment may not be able to explain, right? Is there anything that we cannot explain? And I think the root answer, the root cause of this difference that we see or what we kind of perceive is that there are two concepts, right? One is the concept of existence, right? Existence itself. And the other is the concept of empiricism, right? Empirical data, empirical accessibility. So I'll just explain the two of them. So existence is when you are talking about the existence of a certain reality, right? There is something that exists. It is present essentially. And empirical data means something that you can measure and you can understand in terms of experimental data, for instance, right? So you can, for instance, in a laboratory, you can try to do tests on classical mechanics, for instance, right? You can do tests on fluid dynamics and thermodynamics and so on and so forth. So the question that I posed, or the counter question I posed to that point, was that can we know of existence beyond empiricism, right? Beyond empiricism, that if there is something which is not empirically accessible, does it have a reality or not? Right? Does it have an existence or not? Right? So you may appreciate that in the early part of the 20th century, when quantum physics came into the picture, we had this idea of what is reality, right? Is there a reality which is objective, right? Which means that if I were to see that reality and you were to see that reality, should it be the same, or can there be any differences in the way the reality comes or it appears to us, right? So the thing is, the idea of reality is something we as quantum physicists often quite delve with, right? And how we define various aspects like that of contextuality, like how the context matters, right? When you're defining reality, how the surroundings and the environment matters, where the system is evolving, for instance, right? So I think the question between science and spirituality is one around this point of exploration of truth. However, they are doing it in slightly different manners, right, or different ways. Science, by definition, of course, is premised on empiricism, right? So you are basically trying to formulate various kinds of axioms, for instance, to begin with, or postulates, and then you try to see the verifiability of that, or the matching of that with empirical data that you find. Right. So I always say in the class that Albert Einstein, right, in the early part of the 20th century, he gave us this theory of relativity, right? Relativity, special relativity, and general relativity. But he never got the Nobel Prize for that, right? Very few people know about it. Many of the, in common parlance, we often say relativity is what Einstein's major achievement was, right? It was his major achievement, but there was no empirical test. There was no experiment during his time beyond a point which proved his theory as such, right? I mean, it happened much later. There were other experiments which happened later which proved it, and so Einstein got it for what is known as the photoelectric effect, right? That is there is another effect that he had found, and also another good example is that of Peter Higgs. Peter Higgs gave us the God particle, as we often call it, God's particle, Higgs boson, right? He also got the Nobel Prize about 40 years after he had found the Higgs boson theoretically, right? And the reason was because in Nobel Prizes, or when we talk about physics, it's not only about the maths, right? It's also about how verifiable it is, right? How empirically verifiable and accessible it is, right? So that is very important, and science is premised on that. Now, spirituality, on the other hand, is looking at, as I see it, some aspects of metaphysics or metadynamics, right? For instance, a very fundamental question is, why are the laws of nature the way they are, right? Is there any reason for them to be, for instance, we know F is equal to ma, right? Or E is equal to mc squared, right? So some people would say that it is because by chance we have come to a universe where it's probabilistically that way, right? It's just that it happens to be that way by chance, right? Some others would say that there is a greater order or design in the way the things have happened, right? So there is this concept of accessing that which you do not have empirical access to, right? For instance, we know that in ancient India, we are often told that our Maharishis, right, various seers and luminaries of our Indic tradition, they did not necessarily, undertake empirical kind of studies, right? There was more of introspection. There was more of, we have these concepts of meditation, for instance, and looking inwards, right? Rather than looking outwards. And the whole concept, as I see it, and given my studies of these scriptures, more or less, in the Upanishads or elsewhere as well, there is this concept of self-similarity, right? Self-similarity, which I had, I think, mentioned in one of my talks recently as well. The idea is that everything has a fractal nature, right? There is something which repeats in terms of patterns, in terms of phenomena, or over different scales, right? So if there is self-similarity, then one could potentially find a window for the greater reality and the universe in us ourselves, right? In us, we have the greater universe or the greater reality encapsulated in each of us, right? So the Maharishis actually, as I see it, had tried to look at that fundamental level in a very decentralized manner, right? In a way where they were trying to look inwards, trying to explore that at great length, right? So therefore, I think that is what I see as spirituality, right? Which is this idea of not only the metaphysics, but the metaphysics of metaphysics as well, and so on and so forth, right? Till the point you reach a level which, as the Upanishads say, cannot be described even, right? There is no description for that fundamental level of reality, right? And that is what the Maharishis have tried to explore. Science is looking at a very small subset of that based on empirical realities, right? Or empirical data, as we see it. Yeah.
You have given a lot of information in one go only. Okay. So yeah. So actually, if you can a little bit explain in terms of like, in layman's language. Now, what you have told us now, that is,
Right.
you know, more kind of, technical language. The somebody who doesn't have that much knowledge about science, they might be not able to understand it. So something you can, explain in, I'll say easy words, like
Sure.
people will be able to relate it, like
Yeah.
me. So,
Yeah. So the idea here is that if you were to think of it, yeah, yeah. So there is this idea of experimentation, right? I mean, all of us know that we observe things, right? We've all observed the stars in this night sky, for instance. We've observed things like when petrol is fallen on the streets, right? You see a very beautiful color pattern that you see on the ground, right?
yes.
So there are different ways in which observations can be done or measurements can be done, right? And that is the whole idea of experiments, right? Experimentation means you're taking a certain kind of trial of sorts of a possible phenomena and trying to observe it in reality, right? Now, there is a fundamental question which I was mentioning about empiricism. Empiricism means that anything that you can observe, right? Anything you can access with measurements and observations, right? Now, my question to your viewers is that is reality defined by observations only, right? So, for instance, if I were to reframe that, let's say the reality of the moon, right? We have Chandrayaan-3, which landed on the south pole of the moon recently, right? So the moon itself is something we have observed from we didn't have telescopes back in the day, right? Far back in the day, if you were to think about it, we didn't have the ways to look at the moon beyond the point, right? We obviously saw it when it came on the skies, but for instance, we didn't see the craters or what kind of geological formations there were on the moon, right? Now, my question to you and the audience here is that did the reality of those craters, right? Was it there before we observed it or was it not?
It was there.
It was there, right? It was always there, right?
Yeah.
So there is a certain idea of objective reality, which is beyond your experimental reach, right? Your accessibility by empiricism. Even without that, there is a reality to the moon and its craters and its various phenomena that goes on in there, right?
Yes.
So the question is, that science, right, is always dependent in a certain manner on empirical data, right? On experimentation, on proving a theory, right? So if I were to say tomorrow that there is a new theory of gravity, right? Gravity ka ek naya theory I have presented to you, right? No, none of the physicists will accept it till I have shown that there is one or two experiments which match with the predictions that my theory have given, right? So there is a over-reliance almost of sorts, and that is because by definition, science is that, right? So we will only accept reality when it is proven to us in terms of observations, right?
Sure.
Now, my question was that can we think of reality beyond empiricism, right? Beyond this idea of experimentation, right? And that is exactly what spirituality has been trying to do, right? Because we have been often seen that there are scriptures, for instance, or certain sources where they're talking about things where they clearly did not have experimental reach towards, right? For instance, cosmological reality, right? When the universe began, what happened, right? Now, as a scientist, I do not want to draw conclusions per se, but all I will say is that without that empirical accessibility, they had tried to find insights into the fabric of reality around us, right? How the universe is in a certain way, right? So there is something which is beyond empiricism. And that is what spirituality or metaphysics at times tries to think about or tries to conceive or formulate, right? And so the way to do it, there are many different ways to do it, right? In dharmic traditions, we have different darshans, right? Which are different ways to kind of access it. We have different kinds of yoga systems. You have been pursuing yoga as well. So there is Gyan Yoga, there is Bhakti Yoga, Karma Yoga, and Raj Yoga, right, or Hatha Yoga as well. So there are different kinds of yoga which look at different ways to approach that truth, right? So Gyan Yoga, for instance, will be more in terms of directly trying to access the consciousness in terms of dhyan, dharan, right, and sadhana, for instance, right? In terms of karma yoga, it's more in terms of by doing actions, you reach a stage of of attainment where you can access those realities. And bhakti yoga, of course, is when you are completely in devotion, in a state of devotion, you try to kind of reach out to that reality, right? So there are different ways in which we are trying to reach out to a greater reality than us, right? An absolute fundamental reality of the universe, which is beyond our empirical reach, right? We are not all scientists, right? Or the viewers who are watching this program, we have
All
all
scientists.
understood and thought about, yeah, we have thought about ways to reach God, right? Ways to kind of understand this concept of God, for instance, right? We have, some of us have bhakti, some of us are even atheists for that matter, right? There may be some viewers who are atheists and agnostics, right? And so dharma is very interesting in that sense, Sanatan Dharma, because in Sanatan Dharma, you also have had strands which have been atheistic, right? For instance, the Charvakas and various others, they are not necessarily believing in this astic concept of godhood, right? So in Dharma, we are not talking about a distant God like the Abrahamic God, for instance, right? We are talking about more of the reality of the universe itself, right? At a very fundamental level, what is the reality of the universe? And so, in a way, we are exploring truth, right? But we are not doing it in terms of empirical data. We are not doing it in terms of experimentation all the time, right? We have other ways to explore that truth at a fundamental level, right? So that's how I see spirituality, and that's how I see science as well. Yeah, please.
Oh, thank you. That's nice. So we could understand right now because you have given some examples and I can relate to it. And I can,
Yeah.
understand what exactly you're trying to make us understand. The second thing I want to understand, since we are talking about the reality of the universe, and according to the ancient philosophy, the universe has been created. Like, Samkhya philosophy, as you know, it says, like, out
Yeah.
of consciousness the whole world has been created. So how do we see, like, the theory, the modern theory which talks about the way universe has created, and the ancient science or the ancient philosophy of India says, like, Samkhya philosophy, one of the darshan of, in six darshan. So it said, like, first it is your consciousness. So it is just one consciousness, and we are seeing the all the things, whatever creation we are seeing, whether it is like a stars, moon, planets, and even human beings or animals, everything is, like, we can see because of consciousness, or we can perceive because of consciousness. So what is your say on it?
Right. So there are two very important points in my response that I will give for this. One is that the concept of consciousness itself, right? So science has been trying to kind of reach this idea of what is consciousness, right? So there are many different kinds of biological studies that have been trying to look at neural phenomena, for instance, and trying to see if we can think of consciousness in that respect, right? So
Yes.
there are some theories on that front. I mean, there is a very well-known theory by Tononi, right, which is called the integrated information theory, which says that if you have a lot of information about around you, right, in our human minds, we don't just accept the information, but we also process it, right? We try to integrate it in a meaningful manner, right? So they have been trying to look at consciousness as integrated information, right? Now, but however, this is slightly different from the consciousness that we see in the Hindu scriptures, right? In our scriptures, when we are talking about Chitta, right, or Chaitanya, there are various words for it we have used, right? And even in the conception of Satchitananda, right, the final Godhood, the absolute Godhood, right, there is this concept of Chitta. Now, Chitta is not quite a cerebral or a brain-oriented kind of consciousness we're talking about, right? We're talking about a more fundamental layer of reality, which actually the Upanishadic Maharishis used to say that it is not even describable, right? There is no way to describe it in its most pure form, right? When it is pure consciousness, it has no characteristics even for that matter, right? And which is why many people, like even Buddha, right, when he was asked about God or about consciousness, he never gave a response, right? He just smiled, right? He just said that, there's no response from his side, right? He neither negated it nor did he assert it, right? Because this whole concept of asserting something, of saying that, yes, there is a God, right? Or no, there is no God. This whole concept of this binary, this choice, right? Itself is not applicable to that final reality, right? All the choices that we have, all the forms of binaries don't apply there, right? That's what our scriptures have told us, right? And so consciousness as we know it in science today is not quite saying that, right? And that's not the final reality as we know it, right? Now, coming to the point of Sankhya, right? There is a very important point that Sankhya makes, which is that it brings in the duality of nature. And I'll explain what duality here means, right? Duality of spirit and matter, right? At the very beginning, right? It kind of qualifies it. It kind of makes the distinction very clear from the onset itself. So you have the idea of Purusha and Prakriti, right? Purusha is the more of the spiritual aspect of the universe, right? And Prakriti is more to do with, as the name suggests, nature or the material world that we see as such, right? The energy, the world of energies or the world of empirical reality, right? So now in that case, whereas in Vedanta, we talk about Brahman, right? And we talk about Maya, right? So Brahman is the ultimate reality, and Maya is this veiling kind of aspect, right? This illusory aspect, which makes us see Brahman in different ways, which is not quite true in its fundamental sense, but it is what we see around us, right? So in Sankhya, however, they have spoken about Prakriti and Purusha, right? And there is a way in which Purusha kind of gives rise to there's a whole transition, right? So from Moola Prakriti, which is the basic kind of element of nature, there are different kinds of tanmatras. Tanmatras are these subtle elements in nature. And then there are more grosser elements that come about. And then finally, we see the reality as we see it around us, right? Now, in my definition of science and spirituality, I mentioned that there is this aspect of reality, which is observable, right? Which we can observe in experiments or around us. Now, Prakriti is the level at which these things can be undertaken, right? Because Purusha, by definition, is something which is beyond the idea of observations, right? It is not in the material world per se, right? So which is why there is often a very big misconception that people have when they talk about the Purusha Sukta, right? Purusha Sukta, which is in the Rig Veda, right? We talk about the concept of hierarchies, right? You may have heard about it in terms of different kinds of structures in society, right? The people say that even casteism is based on the Purusha Sukta, right? Now, I will categorically like to highlight and negate that thought process because in the Purusha Sukta, we are talking about Purusha, right? Which is in the Sankhyan perspective, not even material, right? So if something is not material, it cannot have a top, a bottom, and a middle, right? It cannot have this sense of hierarchy or the sense of dimensions or the way in which space is oriented, right? So what the Maharishis were trying to say was that there are just different components of a reality, of a one bigger whole, right? And they're working together, right? That's all they were saying because the concept of hierarchies cannot exist for the Purusha, right? So therefore, this whole concept, when some anti-Hindu forces often say, right, anti-Dharmic forces say that casteism was there since the Rig Veda because Purusha Sukta said that, right, in its wording, right? I don't agree with that in my reading, right? I say that Purusha was never supposed to be quantified in terms of hierarchies, right, or characterized in terms of hierarchies, right? So Purusha and Prakriti are these two levels, and science will only relate more with the Prakriti level, right? Because observations can only happen at the level of the material perspective or the material aspect, right? So science reaching Purusha, the Purusha level, is a little difficult to think about because there is no empirical access to it, right? However, we are seeing that in science, there are different kinds of theories that come up, right? There are different kinds of insights we get, right? So, for instance, science believes in symmetries, right? Symmetries of nature. It believes in different kinds of ways in which nature orders itself, right? There's an ordering in nature as such, right? There are different kinds of dances, as they call it, dances of fluctuations in nature as well, right? Some people talk about Nataraj, right? In the sense of the cosmic dance, right? So there are these perspectives that we see, and there are ways in which we can get insights from that, right? However, we cannot directly test them in scientific experiments per se beyond the point, right? These are insights we draw from the things we see around us, right? So there is a distinction that Sankhya makes, and I am not sure whether we can ever breach that distinction with science itself, right? There has to be more of insights which are more important than that, right? And so it's interesting to see how the interface of the two can happen, right? So there are many people who are trying to see the unified theory of everything, right? The unified theory of nature, right? Stephen Hawking has spoken about it. People like Albert Einstein spoke about it as well, right? That is there only one force in all of nature, right? Till now, we have not found that force per se, right? We have not unified everything as such, right? And Hawking at the very end said that maybe we cannot find the final force as such as well, right? There's a possibility of that even, right? So we are in an interesting stage of the development of science, right? But we have not reached the point where we can explain the Purusha aspect of Samkhya yet, right? That's what I feel. Yeah.
But what about you? Like, do you believe consciousness?
Yes, so I think I always distinguish between two aspects of my reality or my self, essentially. One is the experiential aspect, which is more to do with spirituality, right? And one is more to do with the rigorous scientific aspect that I have as well, right? As a person of science, right? So I have had some, understandings or insights, you can call it, or experiences on the spiritual front, right? Which gives me a belief, if you will, right, that there are certain aspects which are there beyond empiricism as well, right? However, in a forum of science, right, I cannot establish that on scientific grounds because they are not empirical truths per se, right? However, that does not mean they're not true, right? It doesn't mean that they are false, right? But they are not to be equated all the time, right? I don't agree with this idea that many people have, especially when they're pursuing Indic knowledge systems, that they try to equate everything in the Upanishads with everything in modern science, right? I don't think that's a very good thing to do, right? Because I often also say that many times the Maharishis were doing things beyond what modern science is doing, right? In their own ways, right? So equating them, these concepts, is kind of like disrespecting these Maharishis as well, right? So I don't want to do that per se, and I want to keep them as they are. Yeah.
Okay, that's great. So, let's talk about some of the famous, you can say, or well-known people from the science history. Swami Vivekananda and Nikola Tesla. So they met. I think they met outside only in America. Nikola Tesla and Swami Vivekananda, and Swami Vivekananda has shared how the universe has been created. He has shared the concept of ether, like Akash and Brahma, energy, prana, with Nikola Tesla, and he was working around it as well, and he was very much interested, and he was very much impressed, what has been shared by Swami Vivekananda. So what do you think? Do you see, I have gone through the Nikola Tesla's, the biography as well, and I can see, he was the person. I cannot say completely that he was a spiritual person, but definitely he was a scientist, and he wanted to work for the humanity. So he was not the scientist, he wanted to work, just to get some fame, or just to get, more wealth and money for himself, but he wanted to create the better world for the whole humanity. So I think being a good human is also the spiritual side of any person. So what has been your experience?
Yeah.
You must have gone through this particular history of science.
Absolutely. So I think one of the so firstly, so I would like to highlight that I myself am aligned with the Ramakrishna Mission, right? As you may know, right? So the reason that I kind of feel at ease or at home in the Ramakrishna Mission, as some of you may know, is obviously there's an experiential side to it, right, which had drawn me towards in that direction. But there is also this idea of Vedanta, right? Vedanta, as we know it, has been the cornerstone of Sanatana Dharma for various, centuries or millennia even, right? And the idea here is that in the Ramakrishna Mission, there is a confluence or convergence of the Bhakti traditions, right, as well as Vedanta, and also Tantra for that matter, right? And in Vedanta, we always regard one thing as most important, which is that of experience, right? more than even the scriptures at times, or more than even the words of various people, right? It is the experience which is most important. And therefore, I often find the Vedantin be very, very scientific in its own way, right? Because it is talking about that you do not have to believe in anything, right? If I'm telling you that there is God and he's in some coordinates in the universe, right? You do not have to accept that, right? You have to see for yourself whether that is true or not, right? And there is a
Yes.
whole sadhana aspect to it, and then you get wherever you get to, right? Now, Swami Vivekanand had a major role to play in a lot of ways in the sciences, and I'm going to highlight how that is the case, right? So in this case, I'll come to the interaction with Nikola Tesla, but before that, you may have heard about Sister Nivedita, right, who was
Yes.
very close to Swami Vivekananda, and and not many people know that she had a major role to play in promoting Acharya Jagadish Chandra Bose, right? So there was a time when Acharya Jagadish Chandra Bose was working on life and the sense, the idea of sentience or awareness in plants and even in metals, even in like non-living objects, right? And some of these ideas were not taken up by the Western scientists, of course. There was a lot of opposition, essentially, to the point that even papers were not accepted by journals, right? His papers were sometimes being kind of, pushed aside by the journals. And at that time, Sister Nivedita kind of got him the funding to publish all his works in terms of a book, right? Or actually multiple books that were published in the early 20th century, right? So it is very interesting in the manner in which Sister Nivedita was very crucial for Acharya Jagdish Chandra Bose to be able to share his scientific discoveries and his inventions per se at a certain point in time, right? So, and that was directly from Swami Vivekananda's teachings that she thought that this was very important to do, essentially, right? Now, coming to Nikola Tesla, I mean, he had given this idea of various aspects of electromagnetism, of course, and of energy as well. And many people say that he was one of the first people to mention about how energy is the unifying aspect of all of nature, right? I mean, we later on see with Einstein in 1905 that E is equal to mc squared, the very famous formula that many of your viewers may have come across, right? The idea is that mass and energy are equivalent to each other, right? So now Nikola Tesla, then it is said, and if I were to go to the mathematics of it, he gave a formula of the kind E is equal to gamma mc squared, where there was the gamma factor, there was a factor before the mc square, which was not quite resolved, right? So there were some studies and there were some thought processes which were talking about this in a very scientific way. And of course, it was connecting to what Swami Vivekananda had said and Vedanta says about this aspect of energy, right? Energy being a very fundamental aspect of reality as such, right? So we see that there are a lot of correspondences between the two of them, right? And they touch upon different aspects of this reality they were talking about, right? Swami Vivekananda, of course, was talking about it in a more spiritual aspect or side, right? And Nikola Tesla was trying to relate it to the idea of electromagnetism, energy, mass of various particles and objects, for instance, right? So there was an interface that came about, and it was just before the final mass energy equivalence came to be, right? I want to extend this discussion further by saying that today in physics, we have come to a point where there is a theory that everything is only information, right? It's not even mass and energy. Everything is a form of information, right? And physicists who are looking at string theory, for instance, and ATS-CFT, there's a theory on that as well, are talking about this, right? Now, going from that to going towards consciousness is still very far off. However, we have reached a very, very advanced stage of our understanding of nature to the point where there are two important points to be highlighted, right? One is that information is the primary premise of everything, even energy and mass, right? According to certain theories of science as we know it. And the second thing is that nothing is absolute, right? In the early 20th century, Einstein showed us that space-time is not absolute, right? Now we are coming to this conclusion that even the laws of nature, right, and the constants of nature may not be absolute as well, right? There can be a variability in terms of the laws of nature as well in certain regimes, right? Stephen Hawking, before he passed away, had mentioned that there are probably 5 different theories of nature which come together in certain conditions, and they agree on some of these experimental data, right? But they are not all the final theory of everything, right? And there is probably no final theory of everything, right? That is how Stephen Hawking mentioned in his final work, right? So we are coming to these concepts which are, our texts and our thought process, Indic thought process has had for some time, right? Which is that there is a unified aspect of nature, right? and there is no fundamental empirical construct or law as such, right? Which is the final or absolute law in itself, right? And there are various aspects and ways in which it evolves, right? So these are various interesting aspects which science is coming to right now. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting that everything is information. And you have talked about
Yeah.
that, this law of gravity or law of general, relativity of Einstein, even that can be just information. So, and it is changeable. That is also
Yeah.
not constant. It is like,
In fact,
it is
yeah.
bound to
In
change.
fact, in fact, there is a theory recently which has come that the correlations between objects, right, that gives rise to space and time, right?
Oh,
There are certain kinds of correlations. Entanglement, some of the viewers may have heard about entanglement, quantum entanglement, which is the way in which things get correlated with each other. That can, in what is known as the CFT or conformal field theory, I'm not going to the technicalities too much here. It can give rise to the concept of space and time and of gravity as well, right? So there is a theory on those lines also that have been published recently.
Um, I want to come to again to Bengal only. Rabindranath Tagore and Albert Einstein. So even they had very good bond with each other. Uh, at least publicly, it was very good bond, and there is like very good conversation between them regarding the reality of the universe as well. So what I remember, the gist of this conversation, where Rabindranath Tagore uh, they say that he says that the reality is objective. Okay, where you can see whatever human experiences or whatever human consciousness can see or perceive, that is reality, and the reality doesn't exist without human being. If I'm not existing, the reality doesn't exist for me. But as you said, in the initial conversation, you have also said that, you have given this example of the moon, and then there was like a south pole of the moon. So whatever existing is there, it was there. Even if you go there on, even if you are not going to visit the human beings go there or not, it is still there. Like, but that is what the view of Albert Einstein, that really this theory, the theory of reality, that it is existing objectively, but according to Rabindranath Tagore, it is existing subjectively. So, what
Right.
do you say?
Right. So I think it's very important to highlight this principle, right, which is called the anthropomorphic principle, right? Anthropomorphic principle means that it is something which is based on human beings, right? The existence of human beings is the primary thing that you have to focus on, right? So there are some theories which say, why is the Earth the way it is, right? Why is it the only planet which has water and certain kinds of gases and a certain placement in a solar system, right? And there are certain people who say that it is because the human beings had to come about, right? They had to, because to get to this point where we are, right? And to be able to ask this question, all the steps had to take place so that we reach here, right? So it's an interesting aspect. Now, coming to this point of subjectivity and objectivity, it is very important to know that in the early part of the 20th century, when quantum physics came to the picture, in front of us, there was this concept of the observer effect, right? The observer effect, which means that the way a person observes a phenomenon, right? That affects the way the experiment happens, right? So it actually changes the way the experiment happens. And reality itself is not quite objective, but is dependent on the way the observation is done, right? So there is a very different way of looking at nature itself, right? So initially, people started saying that it's probably consciousness of human beings that makes the change happen, right? There was some consciousness element. You may have heard many popular science talks where people say that, observer effect is all about consciousness, right? However, later on, it was seen that there is a observer effect, but it is not quite human dependent, right? It is more dependent on the kind of apparatus that is used, the way the experiment is done. But there is, however, a correlation between that which is measured and that which is measuring it, right? There is always a correlation in a certain way, right? So we can say that science has reached a stage where the correlations matter more than an absolute reality as such, right? So this whole concept that there is an objective reality before the correlative aspect comes into being, right, is not true per se anymore, right? So the way the experiment is done, right, the equipment I use for doing the experiment, right, that will affect how the experiment goes forward, right? So in quantum physics, you have this very famous example, right, which is called the Schrodinger's cat experiment, right? Schrodinger's cat experiment, where Erwin Schrödinger thought about an experiment where he put a cat, right, in a room, right, and there was a radioactive material also kept in the room, right? So for those of you who are not aware of radioactivity beyond a point, radioactive materials emit certain kinds of radiation, right, which can be very lethal for the cat, right, for any human being also and various other living beings, right? So now, after we have placed the cat and the radioactive material, we close the room, right? And now you're asked whether the cat is alive or dead, right? Now, the radioactive material has a certain possibility that it may be activated or it may not be, right? So from outside the room, you cannot say for sure whether the cat is dead or alive, right? It can be dead, it can be alive, right? So Schrödinger gave this in a very famous way. He said that the cat is both dead and alive at the same time, right? Till you observe it to be either of them, right? Till you open the door and you see that the cat is dead or alive, right? So the whole concept of these kinds of binaries, right, and how there's a superposition of these binaries is very, very important. Quantum physics kind of brings in some aspect of subjectivity, but it is not quite human-centered, right? It is more dependent on the correlations between things that observe something and the thing which is observed, right? So there is a correlation between those, and that is what leads to some subjectivity, if you will, right? But it is not quite an subjective reality in the sense that Tagore, right, put it as such in his conversation. It is more to do with the measuring apparatus, right, which is more, it could be non-living kind of apparatus, right? It could be a microscope or a telescope or anything of that kind, right? The way that is oriented, right, affects the way the phenomena also develops, right, or it evolves, right? So there is that aspect in there. And I think that is indeed true, because even if you were to think about consciousness, right? Consciousness as the Upanishads or in the Veds we have kind of seen out there, it is not quite a human-centered consciousness, right? We need to first get this thing out of our minds that we are talking about something which is human-centered only, right? Because chitta is something from which everything comes out, right? It is something which is the fundamental layer of reality, right? Human beings have come much, much later, right? Much later, even in the conception of the Upanishadic thought, right? So human beings have some faculties, some ways of accessing that chitta better than maybe many other beings. That's what is said often in many of the texts, right?
Yes.
But it is not that it is starting or originating from the human beings, right? It is something which is universal, right, in the Upanishadic thought, right? And therefore, we should stop this obsession with having a human-centered approach to everything, right? As a child, I'm sure many of us must have thought about this conception of deities, right? Deities, why are they only human-like, right? For instance, in the Abrahamic faith, of course, there is an ongoing debate as to what Jesus looked like, right? And people say that he was not the white, blue-eyed man he's shown out to be, but he was more like how current day people in the Middle East would be, right? Like, whereas in India, in Bharat, we have always had a certain universality of how the deities are seen, right? So we have, for instance, Ganesh ji, we have Hanuman ji, we have various other deities, right? We have even deities who don't have a form, right? For instance, when we talk about Rahu and Ketu, right? And we say the Navagrahas, right? The Navagrahas and the 9 deities. Oftentimes, Rahu and Ketu are not even displayed or shown, right? So recently, for instance, I had gone to this Chapkeshwar Mahadev Mandir, which is very well known, which is very Jagrat. There's a mandir here, right? Which has shown the Navagraha in terms of small sculptures, right? And for Rahu and Ketu, there is no sculpture. There's a dark black sculpture which shows the absence of them, right? In that pantheon or in that kind of, circle as such.
Because
right?
they are
So it's very
considered
interesting
evil.
how Hinduism.
Maybe because they have
No,
been
they are not
considered
considered.
evil.
Rahu, Ketu are not necessarily in some places, but they are not evil per se. They are part of the Navagrahas only, right? So the way I see it is that even in the absence or in the darkness, right, where there is a sense of reality, right? For instance, Shivji, right? When we talk about Shiv or Krishna, right? Sri Krishna, we say things like, Madhav. There is an aspect of voidness also when we talk about Shivji, right? There is the darkness, the element of darkness also associated at times, right? And even in Tantra, for instance, if you study Tantra extensively, there are aspects which may not be very acceptable in common social terms, right? For instance, tantrics, you may have heard about, viewers may have heard about this, but tantrics have various kinds of rituals, right? The Aghori tantrics, for instance, and various others, right, which look at mortality and life and death in a very dramatic fashion almost, right? They will go to a cemetery and meditate, for instance. They will have various different kinds of rituals, right? So there are things which are not socially acceptable or in the light, so to say, right? But they are also part of that reality, right? So dharma actually is so universal in its ambit, right, in its conception, that it also accounts for all those possibilities as well, right? And that is the beauty of Sanatana Dharma as I see it, right? Yeah.
Yes. Um, just coming to the conclusion right now, I just want to understand, you must have made, so many scientists, like you have done your doctorate from the Cambridge University as well, and you have been with Harvard as a scientist, fellow scientist over there as well. So you must have met many scientists over there as well. You must have met, some scientists in India as well, and you must be meeting on everyday basis as well. So what do you see, like, what kind of belief system you see these scientists, like, whether they are atheist or they are agnostics, or, they have spiritual side. So for
Yeah.
me, I think religion and spirituality can be different things together. So somebody can spiritual, but that person may not be religious. So what kind of, variation you see in scientist community?
Absolutely. So I think before I answer that, I mean, the whole idea of keeping spirituality and science different, right? I can give an example for that. So if you were to want to look at the moon with a microscope, right,
Mm-hmm.
that's a ridiculous thing to do, right? They are both giving you access to certain things in reality, right? But biological cell is much better studied with a microscope than a star, right? Or the moon, for instance, right? So as I see it, and I repeat again my first response in our conversation, which is
Mm-hmm.
that there are different levels of exploration of truth, right? Different
Mm-hmm.
ways to perceive truth, some premised on empiricism, some which are not, right? So there is no need to necessarily bring them together, right? It's quite a ridiculous attempt, even at times, to do that, right? Because even our Maharishis, right, they never try to do that beyond a point, right? For instance, Maharshi Kannad, right? He gave us this idea of atomism, right, in a certain way. Of course, many of his findings are not quite what modern science will say, but he also studied, for instance, magnetism. He studied how fluids work, right? He studied various other aspects as well, right? These were all very, scientific, if you will, studies as such, right? But he also had a spiritual side, right? He got some insights also at various points. He wrote treatises on that as well, right? So if the Maharishis didn't do that, right, if they didn't bring together these different realms together, right, why are we wanting to do it so badly, right? That is my question to the people who try to do that, right? So now coming to your question about the scientists. So the thing is, as I see it, the problem with that science is facing, or Western science is facing, is that many a times the Abrahamic faiths, right, the Abrahamic religions and the conception of God in that has been very different from that of the Dharmic traditions, of course, right? And there is this concept of how in 7 days, for instance, the universe was created. Man and woman came from Adam and Eve, and various other Genesis-based kind of creationism legends, as you will, right? Now, that from a scientific perspective is quite not acceptable, right? Because we know for a fact that we have had evolution, we have had a certain way in which, creatures have evolved over time, right? We started with, a cellular kind of organism of sorts and so on and so forth, right? So that is something which is not quite acceptable, right? So scientists in the West, right, have over centuries actually had a certain opposition to this strand of thought, right? This creationist strand of thought, which is actually, and I want to highlight this, very different from the dharmic perspective, right? In the dharmic perspective, for instance, there is a theory. I mean, some people may differ with me on this, that even the Dashavatar, right, of Sri Vishnu, right, is something which is reflective of the evolutionary aspect, right? Because if you look at it, right, Matsya Avatar, Kurma Avatar, Varaha Avatar, and so on and so forth, they are coming at it from a certain kind of, the sense of the fish, for instance, the beginning, right? Matsya Avatar is in the form of a fish, right? Then Kurma in the form of the tortoise, and then going ahead to the boar, Narasimha, Vamana, and so on and so forth, right? So you have different levels of evolution, right? And also, we never say that God just made us one fine day, right? And or everything one fine day, and things happened in that manner. We talk about, for instance, there are Shaivite schools of thought, right, which talks about spanda, right? Spanda, spota.
Pandit.
Spanda means the first, yes, the first pulsation in the universe, right? There was a consciousness which was still and calm, and then there was one vibration, and then everything came from that, right? There is also the aspect where people say, and this is again conjecture, of course, that the first pulsation had a certain sound, right? So Shiva's, when we talk about Shivji's kind of vibration, right, the primal sound of sorts, right? Some people hypothesize. I still have not made up my mind on this particular point, right? On the fact that the Big Bang, for instance, right, and various other early phenomena had a certain sound element to it, right? There is a study which had been recently published. So we don't go by that thought of the Abrahamic strands of metaphysics as such, right? So when science is opposing, Western science is opposing religion or spirituality, right? I often see that it is because of these doctrinal elements, these elements of particular religious aspects, right, that they are against it, right? Many of the scientists are actually not against spirituality, right? For instance, Albert Einstein is very well known to have spoken about cosmic consciousness, right? And he was a self-professed Spinozist. Spinozist is somebody who believes in the concept, in the philosophy of Spinoza. Spinoza was a Spanish philosopher who thought that the laws of nature are also expressions of God, right? Or also divinity is an expression of divinity as such, right? So Einstein was a self-professed Spinozist, right? And many other scientists, many major scientists have been working on that front, right? But from personal experience, I can say that because of the precedents set by the Abrahamic kind of ways of thinking and creationism, actually, let me be more specific, right? That scientists have had an aversion towards this side of thought, right? In a very, very strong way as well, right? I've seen that in Cambridge as well, and in certain interactions and elsewhere also, right? However, in India, in Bharat, we have now started moving towards this idea in this sense, right? That we have to have a very rigorous and a very truthful exploration of truth, right? Where we don't have to necessarily always equate the Upanishads with modern science, try to get in some concept from here and there and try to make a patchwork of theory to explain it, right? We have to do it in the way the Maharishis did, right? We have to be brave enough to say that there are things we do not know and there are things we do, right? And we have to go at it from a sense of honesty, right? And integrity at that, right? So, for instance, in Bharat, we have Vigyan Bharati. Some of the viewers may know about Vigyan Bharati. So, I am currently leading the Mandala wing of Vigyan Bharati. This is an initiative under Vigyan Bharati. And we are trying to see how ontological and epistemologically, in terms of the fundamental reality and the ways to describe reality, various kinds of in-depth treatises and thought processes, right? Where they're actually reflecting reality and truth at the empirical level, or where they're not, right? Number one. And if number two is if they were not, what were they trying to speak about, right? What was the sense and direction in which they were trying to take that metaphysical strand of thought, right? So we're trying to do it in a very rigorous manner, right? And however, we are not doing the kind of pseudo-scientific approach to it, right? We are not saying that there were certain random things happening in ancient India, right? Just because X, Y, Z said so, right? We are saying that if you are claiming something, right? If you are saying that there's a machine in the past, let's say, right? You need to tell me either the prototype of that, right? Or the design of that, or at least a sense of the direction in which the thought process developed to reach that point of discovery or invention, right? So we are very rigorous in that. And I think that India has to be a Vishwa Guru in that sense, right? In terms of being brave enough to say that reality is sometimes beyond empiricism, right? Reality is not always experimental, right? All the parts of the universe are not accessible to us, right? So in fact, some of the viewers may be interested to know that in the very boundary of the universe, right, at the very periphery of the universe, there is a certain side of the certain part of the universe which cannot be reached even by light, right? If you were to send light there, right, it's called the event horizon, and beyond that, that is not even accessible, right? So if we cannot even access some parts of the universe, right, how can we possibly speak about the phenomena in terms of science, right? If there is no observation possible in some parts of the universe, right, by default, right, then we cannot even talk about science in those terms, right? So does that mean that there is no reality to it, right? That is the question we all need to ask ourselves, right?
Yes.
And so that is where I think Bharat, right, has to take up this position, which it had in the ancient past and in the medieval times also in some parts, that we will have to be brave to think about existence and reality with empiricism and without empiricism as well, right? That is the role I see as Bharat's in a very big way, right, going forward. And if we were to truly look at it in that manner, right, I think that we will not have many of the conflicts and problems we have in the modern world, right? Many of the problems in the modern world comes from a very exclusivist way of thinking, right? That we are correct and they are not, right? That this is correct and this is not, right? That there are just two options, the light and the dark, right? Whereas in our Indic thought process, we always talk about multiplicities, right? That there are often times when even things which are not possible, like for instance, in the Rig Veda, right? There is this Nasagya Sukta, right? In that, the last verse, right, speaks about maybe they know that this is where they're talking about the gods, right? Maybe they know that which is beyond, or maybe even they do not, right? So they are even regarding this in an agnostic manner, right? And they're saying that the final reality is beyond what is existence and non-existence both, right? So if you were to say something like that, that doesn't quite make sense. Because if there is something existent, it cannot be non-existent at the same time, right? And vice versa, right? However, we are talking about a level of logic, right? A level of epistemology, if you will, where the binaries themselves have been transcended, right? There is no absoluteness of that binary even of existence and non-existence, right? So we need to go to those levels of reality or those levels of thinking at least, right? Where we can reconcile things which are apparently contradictory, right? But which are part of the greater whole, right? And that is what I think we in our country and the world today, right, need to promote, right? We need to kind of put forward based on our Indic way of thinking.
Okay, thank you. This was very nice, and definitely I have learned so many things, so many new concept, science, scientific new concept, and you have given so many, I'll say, examples as well. Those are referred to your experiences, and those are referred to some of the, the ancient books available, whether it is, Upanishads or Vedas. So you have given lots of information here, and I think young minds, like specifically young minds, those who are watching it, they will have lots of things from this conversation, and they can go and Google it, or they can just go and search through the books, and they can enrich their knowledge about this particular aspect. So thank you very much,